Vermont Territory, 1887. While most settlers were rushing to get their cabins finished before winter set in, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Nielsen was still swinging a hammer well into late September. Folks around him shook their heads. They said he was wasting time. They said he was plain foolish. What they didn't understand was that Lars wasn't just building a house. He was building a second cabin inside his living room. An 8 by 12-foot wooden box with double walls stuffed tight with sawdust and moss. Instead of the tall 10-foot ceilings everyone else favored, Lars set his ceiling at just 6 feet 10 inches. While other men wrapped up their cabins in 6 weeks, he spent 4 long months working on something that looked more like a shipping crate than a home. Then March 12, 1888 came without mercy. The great blizzard hit fast and hard, dumping 3 feet of snow in just 18 hours. Temperatures crashed to 4 degrees below zero, and the wind came howling hard enough to shatter windows and force snow through every crack in standard log walls. In their big, high-ceilinged rooms, neighbors couldn't stay warm even with fires roaring day and night. Families slept bundled in wool coats while frost crept across their inside walls. But inside Lars's second cabin, the one everyone laughed at, it stayed warm enough that he sat there writing in his notebook with nothing more than shirt sleeves on. The thermometers told the truth, plain as day. Outside it was 4 degrees. In the main room, it hovered around 34. But inside that much-mocked inner cabin, the temperature held steady at 65 degrees. What had Lars figured out about heat, insulation, and survival that everyone else brushed off as foreign nonsense? If you care about practical wisdom that's proven itself over time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more true accounts like this worth remembering. And let us know where you're watching from. We like seeing how far these stories travel. Just before dawn on March 12, 1888, the wind screamed across the Vermont hills, snow pounding the outside of Lars Nielsen's cabin with the steady drumbeat of a blizzard that had been building since midnight. Inside what his neighbors jokingly called a wooden shipping crate, the 45-year-old immigrant sat in his shirt sleeves, writing in a small notebook by the light of a single tallow candle. 3 thermometers hung in carefully chosen spots around his home, quiet witnesses to an experiment that had taken months to prepare. One hung outside the main cabin window, its mercury barely visible through glass clouded with frost. Another was mounted 6 feet off the floor in the big main room, where most frontier families would be huddled close to a cast-iron stove on a night like this. The third thermometer hung inside what Lars called his winter room, the 8 by 12-foot inner cabin he had built right inside his house, set at head height above his narrow bunk. He checked each reading carefully, writing down numbers that would later decide whether he was a clever man or a complete fool. Outside, the mercury showed 4 degrees above zero, while wind gusts rattled the shutters like cannon fire. In the main room, a bucket of water had already formed a thin layer of ice, even with hot coals banked in the stove, and the temperature stayed stuck at 34 degrees. Inside the inner cabin, though, the thermometer held steady at 65, 31 degrees warmer than the rest of the house, and more than 60 degrees warmer than the brutal wind chill that was killing livestock across 3 states. Lars pulled his quilt tighter and caught the sound of shouting somewhere in the storm, a neighbor already in trouble. He made one last note in his ledger, blew out the candle, and settled back into the warmth that had cost him 4 months of mockery and the social standing he'd worked 3 years to build since coming over from Trondheim. The teasing had started back in late August, when Lars first marked out an 8 by 12-foot rectangle in the corner of his main room, close to the cast-iron stove but not crowding it. While everyone else was racing the first frost, Lars was still measuring and figuring, planning a ceiling low enough to stand under, but keeping the total airspace as small as the laws of physics would allow. The math was simple for any man who'd heated a farmhouse through a 7-month Norwegian winter. The outer cabin measured roughly 20 by 28 feet, with 10-foot ceilings, creating about 5,600 cubic feet of air to warm. His winter room, by contrast, held just 672 cubic feet, about 1/8 the volume. Ephraim Cobb, a former soldier who'd appointed himself the local authority on frontier building, watched Lars frame the inner walls with 2x4s instead of logs and declared the whole thing wasteful and unhealthy. "Looks like you're building a rat cage in your parlor, Lars," Cobb announced loud enough for half of Muller's general store to hear. "If you want more heat, just cut more wood like the rest of us." The criticism only grew sharper when Lars picked his materials. Instead of respectable log walls, he sheathed the inner cabin with rough boards, creating double walls with a 1-inch gap that he packed tight with sawdust and dry moss. Materials any sawmill would give away, but most settlers wouldn't trust for anything permanent. Most settlers wouldn't have touched those materials for anything permanent. Sawdust and moss were fine for quick-patch jobs, not for something meant to last. Still, Lars packed them in tight. He hung a plain plank door and tacked a quilt to the inside to act like a soft seal, keeping drafts from sneaking through. The floor became a raised wooden platform, 6 inches above the main cabin's leaky boards, filled with dry planer shavings and straw to block the cold rising from below. Cobb had his answer ready for anyone who questioned him. High ceilings were important, he said, so smoke had somewhere to rise and escape. The neighbors nodded along, repeating the same ideas that had guided frontier building ever since the first cabins went up in Massachusetts. Big spaces meant a solid, honest house. Tight, boxed-in rooms were unhealthy and dangerous. That criticism carried real weight. Cobb had built 3 cabins of his own and helped raise a dozen more, earning himself a reputation as the man who knew what worked and what could get a family killed. When pressed, Lars answered calmly, but he mostly let his numbers do the talking. "It's not the smoke that worries me," Lars told the men gathered around the checkerboard at the general store one September evening. "It's how fast the woodpile disappears." He showed them his records from the previous winter, proving he'd burned 5 full cords just to keep the big room barely livable. Then he explained his math. If he only heated 1/8 the space during the worst cold, he could nearly cut that wood use in half. The idea made sense to him, shaped by memories from his childhood in rural Norway. Back there, farmhouses had small heated cooking rooms and box beds that stayed warm even when the rest of the house froze solid. He'd also spent a winter logging in Quebec, where a French-Canadian foreman named Lair talked about his uncle's room inside a room, a setup that saved cord after cord of firewood by focusing heat where men actually slept. Lars had learned more from Joseph Taco, the Abenaki trapper, who explained how winter wigwams used low roofs and double layers to hold warmth in spaces no bigger than a large closet. But none of that carried much weight with men who had survived Vermont winters using the same methods their fathers and grandfathers relied on. The whole community watched as Lars spent 4 straight days framing the inner shell, followed by another 3 days packing insulation and sealing gaps. Most of the work happened at night by lamplight, after his regular field work was done. The project ate up his evenings through September and into early October, long after sensible men had declared their homes ready for winter. The last straw came when Lars finished the winter room and started what Ephraim Cobb called foolish experiments with thermometers and measuring tools. On calm December nights, when the temperature dropped to 10 or 15 degrees, Lars let his main stove burn down to coals. He shut himself inside the winter room with only a small pan of embers and a single candle, then wrote down the temperature every hour from dusk until midnight. The results were steady and repeatable, enough to fill half a notebook with numbers no one wanted to hear. Now, as the great blizzard of 1888 battered his outer walls and forced snow through every weak point in standard cabin construction, those figures would either prove that months of careful planning had been worth it, or show that he'd been nothing more than a stubborn man refusing to build the way God and common sense supposedly intended. The first real test had come earlier in December, when a cold front dropped nighttime temperatures to 10 degrees above zero, and a stiff wind found every gap in the settlement's poorly chinked walls. From across the hollow, Lars could see the orange glow of his neighbors' windows as they fed their stoves hard and prepared to sleep wrapped in wool, frost already forming on the inside of their glass. Ephraim Cobb's chimney belched smoke like a factory stack, and the widow Martha Briggs had her hired hand splitting wood by lantern light, feeding a hungry fire that barely kept her drafty cabin above freezing. That was when Lars decided to run what he called a controlled experiment. Though Ephraim would later wave it off as just more proof of foreign strangeness. Thermometers and shut himself inside the winter room with just a small pan of embers resting on a brick stand and a single tallow candle for light. From dusk until midnight, he took readings every hour, writing them down to see whether his idea would stand up or fall apart as the product of a man who'd spent too much time with pencils and measurements. At 6 o'clock in the evening, as the last light slipped away behind thick clouds, the numbers began moving exactly the way physics said they should, even if frontier wisdom refused to accept it. Outside, the mercury read 18 degrees and was still falling. In the big room, with its 10-foot ceiling and more than 5,000 cubic feet of air to warm, the temperature showed 45 degrees at the center and just 38 near the floor where children usually slept. Inside the winter room, packed tight with sawdust insulation and sized to heat only 672 cubic feet, the thermometer held at 52 degrees, even though it was getting no more heat than a cat might give off. 2 hours later, with the main stove reduced to glowing coals and the outside temperature down to 14 degrees, the difference between the two spaces had grown sharp enough to tell a clear story, one that would have impressed any university professor willing to care about the hard math of frontier life. The big room slipped to 38 degrees and kept dropping as warmth leaked through the log walls and drifted upward into the high ceiling, where it cooled and disappeared. The winter room, sealed by double walls and capped with a low ceiling that trapped heat instead of wasting it, actually climbed to 62 degrees as Lars's body heat and the small ember pan worked together in the tight space. By midnight, with the outside temperature down to 12 degrees and winds that made even the thermometer seem hopeful, the experiment had delivered results that could change how a thinking man faced winter. The big room sat at 34 degrees, cold enough for water to freeze and for families to wake with ice crystals on their blankets. The winter room stayed steady at 60 degrees, warm enough to work in shirt sleeves and sleep without worrying about frostbite stealing fingers or toes. The math behind it was simple for any homesteader who understood that heating air took fuel and that fuel cost time, labor, and sweat that could be used for other survival work. Lars had proven that a space 1/8 the size could be kept 30 degrees warmer using less than 1/10 the fuel. That difference meant burning 5 cords of wood in a winter or getting by on 2.5. On the frontier, where every cord meant days of cutting, splitting, and hauling, that kind of savings translated directly into safety and peace of mind. Still, numbers didn't count for much with neighbors who had survived past winters using the same methods their fathers had taught them. and their grandfathers before that in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Ephraim Cobb looked over Lars's thermometers and declared them faulty, insisting that properly calibrated instruments wouldn't show anything so extreme. When Lars offered to lend him the tools so he could test it himself, the former soldier waved the idea away. "Everyone knows you need space to breathe," he said, "and room for smoke to rise." Before long, the argument moved past measurements and into questions of health and morality, tapping into deeper fears about foreign ideas challenging American common sense. "It's not healthy to sleep in a space that tight," Martha Briggs's hired man said after looking over the winter room, especially with a coal pan that could foul the air. The concern wasn't unreasonable, though Lars had been careful to place the embers safely and crack the door slightly for ventilation during his tests. More than that, though, there was a lingering suspicion that any man willing to box himself in like that lacked the independence and openness frontier life was supposed to build. "I want a house I can walk around in," Ephraim declared one day at Miller's store. "Not a shipping crate that makes a man feel like cargo." That attitude ran deeper than worries about fuel or efficiency. For settlers who had fought hard for their land and built large cabins as proof they'd conquered the wilderness, Lars's winter room felt like a step backward, a return to the cramped European living they believed they'd crossed an ocean to leave behind. And yet, by January, when a short thaw gave folks a chance to check their woodpiles, the winter room's advantage became hard to deny. The stacks outside each cabin told the story better than words ever could. Most families had already burned through 2 cords from their original 6, while Lars's carefully measured supply was barely touched. Lars's careful record-keeping made the difference impossible to ignore. His fuel use was running at less than half the settlement average, a savings that meant fewer days cutting wood, less risk during deep cold, and real protection against the kind of winter that could burn through a woodpile and leave a family helpless. Joseph Taco, the Abenaki trapper who moved easily between white settlements and traditional hunting camps, studied the winter room with the quiet recognition of a man whose people had solved these problems long before iron stoves or glass thermometers ever reached the forest. "Your inner cabin is like our winter wigwams," Joseph told Lars during a January trading visit, pointing out that it was built with boards instead of bark and moss, but followed the same ideas. The comparison fit. Both designs relied on small enclosed spaces, trapped air for insulation, and solid materials to hold heat, creating warm shelters inside larger protective shells. What Lars had built wasn't reckless experimentation at all. It was a wooden version of knowledge that had kept people alive through countless hard winters. Knowing that gave Lars confidence as the truly brutal weather drew closer, even if it did nothing to soften the doubts of neighbors who still believed big rooms, tall ceilings, and roaring fires were the only real defense against cold that could kill a family in their sleep. Like many deadly storms, the Great Blizzard of 1888 began by fooling people. Early March brought several days of mild temperatures and steady rain, convincing settlers to relax and let their fires burn low, sure that winter had finally loosened its grip. Some even laughed at Lars for still sleeping in what Ephraim Cobb called the wooden box so late in the season, hinting that any man who needed such measures lacked the toughness frontier life demanded. Then, on March 11th, the storm struck with a sudden violence that would earn it a place among the deadliest weather events in American history. What later scientists would describe as a collision between warm Gulf air and Arctic cold created a weather bomb. Temperatures dropped from just above freezing to the single digits in a matter of hours, while winds of 45 to 50 miles an hour drove snow through every seam and crack that had seemed sound during calmer days across New England. By the time it spent itself, the storm would leave behind 20 to 40 inches of snow, with drifts rising 12 to 40 feet high, trapping families indoors and killing livestock by the thousands. In the first hours, as snow piled up against cabin walls and forced its way through log joints despite moss and mud chinking, the weaknesses of standard frontier construction were exposed with deadly clarity. Cabins with high ceilings that felt roomy and healthy during moderate cold became impossible to heat. Warm air gathered uselessly near the rafters, while children shivered on floors that stayed 20 or 30 degrees colder. Ice formed on inside walls where moist indoor air met frozen logs, and the driving wind pushed snow through cracks no one had noticed before. Lars set his 3 thermometers in place, knowing this storm would turn into a test between competing ideas of survival. He took no satisfaction in the coming proof of methods that had cost him months of respect among his neighbors. At 4 o'clock on the morning of March the 13th, as the blizzard reached its peak and shutters rattled across the settlement, his readings recorded the same patterns modern building science would later explain. Patterns frontier wisdom still refused to accept. Outside his cabin, the thermometer read 3 degrees above zero, while the wind drove the effective cold far beyond what an exposed person could survive. In the main room, where Lars had kept his fire low to save wood that might be needed for days, the temperature held at 33 degrees at the 6-foot mark, cold enough that his breath showed and frost began creeping over metal surfaces. Inside the winter room, protected by double walls packed with sawdust and warmed by a tightly controlled space that trapped every bit of heat, the temperature stayed at 64 degrees. It was steady enough for a man to sleep without fear and work barehanded if needed. By midday on March the 13th, neighbors realized their woodpiles were shrinking faster than planned, and their cabins were turning unlivable. Even as they burned cord after cord of precious fuel, the winter room's value had moved beyond comfort into something far more serious: survival itself. Ephraim Cobb's large cabin, measured with a thermometer Lars had loaned him, showed exactly what physics predicted. Near the stove, the air was warm. Near the floor where his family slept, it was dangerously cold. Still, frontier pride made it hard to admit what the numbers were saying. Right next to Ephraim's roaring stove, the air temperature climbed to 54 degrees. But over in the corner where his children slept, down near the floor and against an outside wall, the temperature had sunk to 28 degrees, cold enough to kill. Lars wrote down his own readings carefully, knowing that the numbers he was collecting might one day save lives or change how practical men thought about building for winter. In Lars's cabin, the main room stayed at 36 degrees, even though he wasn't feeding the stove hard. The winter room, on the other hand, held steady at 66 degrees, warmed by nothing more than leftover heat from the outer space and the stored warmth created by tight construction and solid insulation. A difference of 31 degrees, separated by little more than a thin wall, showed just how powerful controlled space and trapped air could be when heat was limited. The reason for that gap wasn't complicated. Any farmer could understand it if he set aside habit and watched how heat actually behaved. Warm air rises, and a high ceiling gives that heat plenty of room to drift upward and vanish before it ever reaches the floor where people live and sleep. A smaller room holds less air and has less wall and ceiling surface for heat to leak through. The outer log cabin now worked like a windbreak and a shell of packed snow, similar to an outer coat that took the brunt of the storm. Inside that shell, the winter room acted like a shirt and a wool sweater, trapping body heat and squeezing the most out of every small heat source. Across the settlement, the human cost of these differences became painfully clear as indoor temperatures dropped below what was safe to live in. One family's infant developed a dangerous cough after spending the night beside a frozen outside wall where moisture had turned to ice, a condition no stack of blankets could fix. Martha Briggs, the elderly widow whose firewood ran short on the storm's second day, watched her cabin temperature sink toward freezing despite her frantic attempts to keep a fire going with green wood and broken furniture that smoked more than it warmed. Inside his winter room, Lars kept conditions steady enough for normal life, even while the storm outside raged with a violence people would talk about for generations. The temperature gap his neighbors had once brushed off as bad instruments or foreign superstition now marked the line between a place where children could sleep safely and a place where families fought the cold inch by inch. The third day of the storm brought a relentless pounding that tested every idea about what counted as proper preparation. It exposed which building methods could stand up to blowing snow, bitter cold, and wind that hunted down every weakness in wood and workmanship. Standard cabins were reduced to little more than shells, offering protection no better than well-made tents. The winter room, by contrast, proved that tight insulation and limited space could create a refuge that stayed livable no matter how bad things got outside. By the time daylight broke on March 14th, the settlement stood at a crossroads. The methods that seemed fine during ordinary cold had failed, while the techniques that worked under true winter pressure had proven their worth. The first plea for help came just after dusk on March the 13th, when Ephraim Cobb staggered up to Lars's door, half frozen, his hat rimmed with ice and his coat stiff with snow from the short walk between cabins. The same man who had spent months mocking the winter room now stood in Lars's main cabin, asking if his wife and children might sleep in the very space he'd once dismissed as a wooden shipping crate unfit for people. Lars hesitated only long enough to glance at the size of his winter room and do the quiet, human math of survival. The inner cabin measured 8 feet by 12, with a built-in bunk running 6.5 feet along one wall, a narrow bench for clothes, and hooks where the family hung their winter gear. Lars's own family of 4 already filled the space the way it was meant to be used. Adding Ephraim's wife and 3 children brought the total to 7, which meant allowing roughly 18 to 20 square feet per person if they arranged themselves the way Lars remembered from the box beds of his childhood. Children sleeping crosswise on the bunk, adults stretched along the floor on straw ticks and wool blankets. It was a setup tight enough to push hard against American ideas of personal space and comfort. But European farm families had lived through countless brutal winters using the same approach. In fact, crowding together would make the room warmer, adding body heat to the small candle and ember pan that were the only direct heat sources. Lars made the choice that frontier hospitality demanded and opened his winter room to neighbors who had nowhere else to go as the cold dropped toward levels that could kill a healthy adult in just a few hours. Martha Briggs arrived shortly after midnight, guided through the storm by Joseph Taco, who had found her cabin barely livable and her firewood gone. The Abenaki trapper helped settle the elderly widow into the winter room and took in the arrangement with the practiced eye of someone whose people had packed into small winter lodges for generations before settlers ever reached these woods. The space now held 8 people inside 96 square feet, conditions that would have horrified most frontier families during normal weather. But in this storm, that closeness meant the difference between living and dying, while livestock froze in their barns outside. Lars ran his heating plan with the care of an engineer tending a steam boiler. He fed his main stove enough wood to build a base of warmth, then let it burn down to coals before relying on smaller heat sources that the winter room could safely handle without risking smoke buildup or fire. A single coal pan set on bricks gave off steady, radiant heat, while 2 tallow candles added light and about as much warmth as a cat curled up nearby. All told, the system produced maybe 200 watts of heat, no stronger than a modern space heater, but it was warming just 672 cubic feet of well-insulated space instead of the 5,600 cubic feet his neighbors were trying to heat by burning whole trees. The proof showed up on Lars's thermometers with the clarity of a laboratory test. Even though it was happening in the middle of a raging storm, no professor would ever sign up to study. Outside, temperatures hovered between 3 and 6 degrees above zero, with winds that pushed the effective cold far past what an exposed person could survive. In the main cabin, temperatures stayed between 30 and 34 degrees, cold enough for water to freeze and breath to hang in the air. Inside the winter room, with 8 people adding their body heat to the mix, the temperature climbed as high as 70 degrees when everyone was present and settled back to 63 by dawn. That was more than 60 degrees warmer than outside, and nearly 30 degrees warmer than the outer room where most frontier families would have tried to ride out the storm. During the worst hours of the blizzard, as the wind screamed around the cabin and forced snow through cracks no one had noticed before, the winter room stayed calm and livable. People talked in normal voices and slept comfortably. Children who would have spent the night shaking in wool coats and piled blankets slept in their everyday clothes, while adults found it warm enough to shed heavy layers and move without fear of frostbite on exposed skin. Sometime during the night, Ephraim Cobb, stretched out on the floor near the inner wall, reached over and laid his hand on the boards Lars had packed with sawdust and moss. They felt only slightly cool, nothing like the outer log walls, which were coated in frost and ice despite fires that chewed through wood at an unsustainable pace. That simple touch convinced him more than any thermometer or calculation ever had. It was the kind of proof frontier men trusted, something you could feel for yourself. "How thick did you say these walls were?" Ephraim asked quietly, careful not to wake the children who were sleeping soundly for the first time in 3 days. Lars explained it in plain terms any carpenter could follow. 2 layers of 3/4-inch boards, with 1.5 inches of sawdust and moss packed between them, plus the same setup overhead in the ceiling. Altogether, the walls were less than 3 inches thick, yet the trapped air in that insulation worked better than log walls 3 times as thick. "We fought over inches of ground in the war," Ephraim muttered as he eased himself back onto his makeshift bed. "And I never figured 1.5 inches of sawdust would matter this much." That small admission went beyond technical respect. It marked the first crack in a way of thinking that would eventually change how the settlement viewed winter building and the cost of staying warm. Martha Briggs, sitting near the door so she could keep an eye on the main room's temperature, remarked that the winter room felt warmer than her own house ever had, even on mild nights with a full fire burning. Her comparison pointed to a hard truth. Standard frontier cabins simply didn't measure up to building methods refined over centuries of northern European winters. In their rush to stake claims and build fast, American settlers had left behind knowledge that once kept people alive. As dawn crept closer and the storm finally began to lose its grip, the winter room had proven it could preserve life under conditions that had turned deadly elsewhere. 8 people made it through in real comfort, using only a fraction of the fuel their neighbors burned while barely keeping their leaky cabins livable. The blizzard finally broke on March 15th, followed by the sudden quiet that comes after nature spends its worst fury. The land lay changed, with snow piled up to cabin eaves and some homes buried clear out of sight. As settlers dug free from what would be remembered as one of the deadliest storms in American history, they started counting losses that went far beyond damaged buildings. News spread slowly that an infant had died in a poorly built cabin 3 miles north, where thin walls and bad chinking let the cold seep in until the family's defenses failed. In the days that followed, as neighbors compared notes and took stock of livestock losses, ruined buildings, and shrinking woodpiles, the differences between construction methods became too clear to shrug off as foreign oddities. At Miller's General Store, Martha Briggs told anyone who would listen that the winter room stayed warmer during the blizzard than her own house ever had on a normal night with a roaring fire. Ephraim Cobb, swallowing a heavy dose of pride, admitted his family would have been in real danger without Lars's inner cabin. He also confessed that his large, high-ceilinged room had been nearly impossible to heat, even while burning wood fast enough to empty his winter supply in a matter of weeks. Taken together, these accounts challenged ideas about proper frontier building that had guided settlements since the earliest days in Massachusetts. Big rooms with tall ceilings, long seen as signs of comfort and success, were exposed as heat-wasting traps that turned deadly when winter showed its teeth. Log cabins that leaked air and once seemed good enough in moderate cold became hazards when wind-driven snow forced icy air through every hidden gap. And within months of the blizzard, several neighbors began building their own versions of the winter room, adjusting Lars's basic ideas to fit their cabins and the size of their families. Ephraim Cobb was one of the first to change. He built a partial inner wall around his stove, creating an 8 by 10 foot space with a lowered ceiling that could be heated efficiently during the worst cold, while still leaving his larger room usable when the weather was milder. Widow Briggs hired Joseph Taco to help her frame a winter bedroom inside her cabin, using the same double-wall setup packed with sawdust that had carried Lars's family safely through the storm. What followed showed how fast practical knowledge can spread once real results push past cultural resistance. Men who had once brushed off Lars's winter room as old-world foolishness now studied every detail, asking about wall thickness, ceiling height, and which insulation worked best. This shift went deeper than simple curiosity. It marked a new way of thinking about comfort, safety, and fuel use, the balance that decided whether a family made it through a hard winter or not. Joseph Taco watched the settlement's sudden interest in small, heated spaces with quiet satisfaction, seeing long-held traditions finally earn their due. Now they put a wigwam inside a house and call it progress, he told Lars during a trading visit, linking the winter room to native building practices that had protected people through countless harsh winters before iron stoves and glass windows ever reached the woods. That comparison made the truth clear. What many had treated as a bold new idea was really a wooden version of techniques refined over centuries by people who understood that survival meant working with heat, not fighting it with bigger fires. As word spread beyond the settlement to nearby towns and eventually into farming journals, the winter room took its place in a much longer history. Colonial keeping rooms, where families naturally gathered into the smallest, warmest space during winter, followed the same idea, even if they lacked precise measurements. European box beds and Dutch closet beds trapped body heat in enclosed sleeping spaces, saving fuel while keeping people warm inside larger houses that were too costly to heat all at once. Native winter lodges and wigwams did the same, using compact shapes, double layers, and even banked snow to hold warmth through dead air and solid mass, no matter how fierce the cold outside. The winter room pulled all of those lessons together into a design that could be built with frontier tools and materials, yet performed better than standard log cabins heated by cast iron stoves. Years later, modern building science would put names and formulas to the principles Lars had used through experience and tradition, showing how limited air volume, good insulation, and fewer heat leaks could dramatically improve efficiency, safety, and comfort. House within a house designs and interior insulation would become common solutions when rebuilding the outside wasn't practical or affordable. The winter room's legacy reached beyond carpentry. It raised harder questions about how communities decide which ideas to accept, especially when those ideas challenge habits tied to pride and identity. Lars's story showed that solid results could break through resistance, but often only after a crisis exposed the weakness of methods that once seemed good enough. Lars's eldest son, Caleb Nielsen, inherited both the cabin and the lesson of the blizzard of 1888. When he built his own home years later, he designed it from the start with a low-ceilinged winter bedroom and a tight inner shell, avoiding the compromises his father had been forced to make. That shift, from emergency fix to normal practice, proved the winter room wasn't a fluke. It was a method that could be repeated, improved, and passed on. And on a bitter frontier winter, it wasn't the biggest house or the hottest stove that kept a man alive. It was how little space he chose to heat, how well he sealed it, and whether he trusted the hard-earned wisdom that said survival sometimes means shrinking your world and thickening your walls when the cold comes looking to kill.